seems so hard to measure. And, I want to ask you, I'm going to pull up a chart of Bloomberg TV, right? Let's pull up a chart of yield curves in the U.S. They're all moving up. And I think the idea is this. So let's take the war analogy going. Maybe you're winning the war. Maybe it's almost over, or you're far enough along that you don't need to land tons of troops and build so many tanks because you've already done so much, and you're heading down that road with what you've already done. I think that's the question people are asking. And of course, which leads to this whole thing about inflation, overheating, the Fed may have to raise rates, and maybe the idea that, again, the stimulus could be just rethought, redesigned, and sort of retargeted in a way. What do you think?
Well, first of all, this thing will be over, and we can see the end, but there's a pretty big chasm between now and then. And we could still lose this thing, right? If because we're not providing enough aid, people rush back into too much in-person contact, we have too much pressure for premature reopening, and we get the infections going again, and then the variants get ahead of the vaccines, right? That's the nightmare scenario. There is still a way we can lose this. We probably won't. It's probably going to be okay. I'm quite optimistic about where we will be at this time next year, but it's still a hell of a chasm that we need to build a bridge across right now. And so we do need to do that. Now, the overheating, this is a very big program, and the U.S. economy does not have unlimited capacity, and there is, it's within the realm of possible. If you do the math, and the math is highly uncertain, if you do the math, it's possible that we're going to see some overheating. I think it's going to be minor, but I could be wrong about that. But the Fed can, if necessary, tighten money, and the risks are hugely asymmetric. If we do too much and the Fed has to raise rates, well, that'll be annoying. If we do too little and the thing falls short, then we're repeating the sad story of what happened after 2009 all over again. We do not want to be in that position. So the risks are very heavily weighted towards go big and be prepared to pull back a bit if necessary later, but not now.
So I want to keep the focus on Washington and Joe Biden and policy, but a different kind of policy that you have talked about a lot over the years because it's trade. Of course, that's where you won your Nobel Prize. Biden's in no hurry to remove tariffs. He, along with Janet Yellen, have signaled this let's stay tough on China stance. What is your view on trade with China? Should Biden, for example, remove the tariffs on China?
Okay, the China story is a little bit complicated because the Chinese are not good actors. It was not the case that China was a blameless, victim of U.S. protectionism. The trouble was that protectionism that Trump did was completely, it was incoherent, and it wasn't aimed at all at the real issues. The real issues are Chinese industrial policy, to a certain extent, Chinese intellectual property. And so, getting tough with China, but in a smart way, makes a whole lot of sense. And look, there's the weird thing about international trade policy is that the more you know about it, the less worked up you tend to get about it. Those of us who've really studied it, we're not happy with the trade war, but we didn't see it as much of a disaster as a lot of people who sort of aren't into trade policy issues really were. And so it's not as if removing those Trump tariffs is the most essential thing. And again, you can't talk anything about the United States without politics. With the Republicans just dying to portray Biden as being soft on China, with never mind what the realities are, he should be in no rush. He should make sure that he has a smart policy that is not easily characterized as getting wimpy on the China issue.
We had a recent study from the National Bureau of Economic Research taking a look at the age-old minimum wage debate, right? And part of the research found that there's a large, substantial body of evidence that point to the negative effects, particularly when it comes to low-skilled or less skilled, I should say, workers and their unemployment. I'm wondering, and I know Kathleen drew attention to this report as well when we were preparing for this interview, we're both wondering whether you've read that report, and does that change your views on whether a minimum wage reform should happen in the US?
I think I've read that report. But it's not a report. It's by a report. The National Bureau of Economic Research is a is a network of people, all of whom get to put out working papers. I can put out an NBER working paper whenever I like. It's not the same as a study that has the imprimatur of the organization. And the story about minimum wage, about the research, is that there's a large body of research that finds very few negative effects, but there is a faction that keeps rejecting the methodology that the rest of the profession is adopting and keeps on saying, no, there are negative effects. And, these things happen. I won't speculate about motives, but the overwhelming, we have a lot of natural experiments because states change their minimum wages all the time and neighboring states don't. And the overwhelming body of that evidence says that the employment effects are possibly negative, but small. And I'm not going to pick, say that, okay, now here's this new paper that somehow refutes what dozens of previous papers based on very careful collation of evidence have found. The overwhelming evidence is that minimum wages do much less harm to employment than economists used to think, and they do a lot to increase incomes. They do a lot to alleviate poverty.
Okay, well, it is a look at all the studies that have been done since the early 90s, but we know what you think, so that's what counts.
Yeah.
What I want to know now, because it's an important topic now for the president, for Congress, and certainly for people across this country, forgiving student debt. It's not just Republicans who have questions about this. There are Democrats, there's all kinds of people. We know people who desperately need it, and we know people who took on debt, and other people who say, why give them so relief? Actually, I'll admit it was a Republican, said this is kind of an insult to blue-collar workers, people who didn't go to college. How do you tie all those pieces together and come up with an equitable plan, Paul?
I'm on the generous side because we have to, first of all, an awful lot of blue-collar workers took on debt to go to vocational schools that didn't do very much for them, or they were told you need to get a college degree and then ended up not getting a degree and ended up loaded with debt. And there's a caricature here which says that, people took on student debt to go to Harvard. That's such a tiny thing. Those elite schools that, it's easy to hate the elite schools, but there's so few that. Part of the problem with the elite schools is they're so tiny. That's a tiny handful of people. And there are many, many Americans who, in good faith, took on debt but were misled, took on debt to go to for-profit education that was worthless, or took on debt based upon expectations of income returns that they were fed that were unrealistic. And this is something where giving up people substantial debt relief is something you can do to improve the lives of a lot of people. It's not rewarding your responsibility. I'm much closer to the sort of Elizabeth Warren position than I am to the very, very modest stuff that we're hearing from the White House right now.